Hello to my abnormal psych students. Tonight I'm going to be doing a lecture on different types of depression, and this is under the broad heading of mood disorders. I, uh, I recorded this last night only to discover that I didn't actually hit the record button. So it's running now, though. I'm here. So as soon as I get this done, it's 8 o'clock now. I will upload this onto YouTube. And just to remind you, on YouTube, search for R. Linden 4, the number 4, and it'll take you to my YouTube channel. And the only ones you need to be concerned about are the ones that are labeled abnormal psych or AP. I hope you're all doing well. As you can see, the lighting's a little bit different. I read this article on what to try not to do, and of course I was doing everything I shouldn't. Um, anyway, so I just wanted to start by wait.
Oh, hi. Are you his students? He's terrible, isn't he? He's so boring. I just can't stand him. Oh, I feel so bad for you.
Hey, get out of there. I'm sorry. That was unexpected. You be quiet. You just sit there. Okay. I know it's pretty pathetic, but here we are. So anyway, tonight we're going to be talking about different types of depression. And this area of mood disorders, if you haven't seen my first lecture on mood disorders, I'd like to encourage you to look at that first before this one, just because that first one sets the stage for this tonight. There's a lot to mood disorders. I mean, it's a world. And tonight we're going to be looking at depression, but I expect that later this week, I'll be doing a part 3, which will look at bipolar disorder. So I think it's useful to start with to think of depression a little bit along the lines of the way that we think of autism. As you know, autism is a spectrum disorder. It comes in many different flavors. It comes in different levels of severity. And the same thing is true with depression. There's no one type of depression. The DSM-5 recognizes a number of different types of depression. Now, from last lecture, you know that all depressions share certain symptoms in common. We've already talked about those symptoms. But the flip side is depressions vary in terms of severity. They vary in terms of chronicity. Some depressions are acute and short-lived events. Others can last much, much longer. And they also differ in terms of etiology or causation. And I think depression is one of the best examples of the biopsychosocial model of etiology that we talked about back in the beginning of the semester. To just recap that, the big picture is psychological disorders, and specifically depression, can sometimes be tied to biological things going on physically in the body, such as genetics, neurotransmitter imbalances, those brain chemicals, hormones. But they can also be not just biological, they can be psychologically driven. They can have to do with a person's self-identity, self-esteem. They can have to do with certain things that that person learned to believe about themselves or the world when they were young. And then the third piece are the socio-cultural possibilities. Depression is far more common in certain cultures than other cultures. And that's really not explained genetically. That's explained better in terms of different types of social forces at work, social pressures, cultural norms, and so on. So in the United States, the way in which boys and girls are raised leads to differences in the way depression is experienced based on gender. And when we compare American cultural norms with norms in other cultures, it's not shocking to say that in certain other cultures, Depression is a far less common sort of thing that's seen. So it's really a good example, again, of that biopsychosocial model. There are three different pieces in play that can tie to the development of depressions. Some depressions are more biologically driven. Other depressions are more psychologically or socioculturally driven. But all three factors can be in play in a mood disorder like depression. So to just kind of start with, um, one of the themes of this course is that psychological disorders are exaggerations of normal human behavior. And following that line of thought, I'd like to suggest to you that sometimes the experience of depression is an absolutely normal response to the sorts of things that can happen to us in life. In fact, there's a concept that many psychologists have called normal depression. And the idea there is that under certain conditions, it can be normal to feel depressed. Um, Live long enough, and every one of us will experience a multitude of losses. We will lose people who are precious to us. We will lose things that are vital to us. And one way to think of depression is that in response to a significant loss, it's not unusual for a human being or an animal in general to kind of pull back, retreat, withdraw, kind of hunker down, conserve their energy, and just try to kind of withdraw from the pressures of life for a while and then eventually re-engage. And I think a good example of a normal experience of depression is the experience of grieving, of what's called a grief reaction. When we lose somebody important to us, whether through that person's death or separation or an end of a relationship, the process of grieving involves some of these signs that we see in depression, often a decrease in energy, a preoccupation with a loss, feelings of sadness and or anxiety. And so we want to be sure not to pathologize all of those experiences. And, that's why the DSM recognizes this concept of normal grieving. But it's a big difference between a grief reaction and a full-on depression. And so if somebody you love died in the last year of your life and you've been grieving them, that's not a depression. But imagine it's 4 years from now, 5 years from now, and your life is still kind of constricted and you've never been able to kind of get back to living the life that you were experiencing earlier. That might be in a different category at that point. And tied to that is a lot of people confuse sadness and depression and use those terms interchangeably. They're really quite different. Sadness is a pure emotion. It's like it's like experiencing fear or anger. Sadness is a primary, it's a genetically hardwired emotion. And being very sad in response to some sort of situation that's happened to you does not mean that you are necessarily depressed. Depression is often, sometimes it's sadness plus a lot of other experiences, like guilt, like helplessness, like hopelessness, utter despair. Um, Depression is not a pure emotional experience. And there are people who are clinically depressed who don't describe feelings of sadness. They may describe more feelings of emptiness or hollowness or feeling numb. So I just want to make sure that you understand that there's a distinction between the experience of straight on sadness and depression. They can overlap, obviously, right? But they're not exactly the same. And similarly, anxiety and depression can overlap, and it's really like a Venn diagram. Lots of people who are depressed also have a component of anxiety, symptoms of anxiety mixed in with the depression. And then the flip side is people who have been struggling with excessive anxiety for long amounts of time will sometimes develop like a secondary depression on top of the anxiety because if you've been anxious for a long period of time and every tool that you've used to try to solve it hasn't worked, that can leave you with a sense of just having, you're depleted, you have no resources left. So sometimes long-term anxiety can morph into a depression because you haven't been able to find a way to solve that fundamental problem with anxiety. So tonight I really want to talk about two different types of depression. Now, again, these are both discussed in various case studies, but also in your main textbook. And the first one I want to talk about is called dysthymia, also known as the dysthymic disorder, and that's dysthymic. Dysthymia is a particular type of depression. And to kind of characterize what it is, when a person's dysthymic, they are generally not severely depressed. The depression would be characterized as mild to moderate. And to understand what the terms I'm using now, that's why you need to watch the previous video first, where we talk about that. The person is certainly depressed, but it's a mild to moderate depression. But the other factor in dysthymia is that without treatment, it is chronic. It is a long-term depression. To diagnose somebody with dysthymia, they have to have the symptoms of mild to moderate ongoing depression, meaning most days of the week they're feeling this way, for a minimum of 2 years. And frankly, a lot of people with dysthymia will say to you, I have felt down and blue for my whole life. It's hard for me to remember a time when I didn't feel this way. That's one of the reasons why dysthymia is sometimes underdiagnosed and undertreated, because the roots of dysthymia can sometimes be tied back to childhood experience. A lot of people who are dysthymic don't realize they're dysthymic. They just assume that this is who they are and this is their personality. And they've always felt kind of slow and more pessimistic and more negative than their cohort groups. And so it's not even sometimes recognized as a disorder. This is very different as compared to major depression, in which the symptoms are significantly more severe. In major depression, you would know that something is off. But dysthymia sometimes flies under the radar for the reasons that I just mentioned. So it's chronic without treatment. It often has to do with childhood events, and it is the symptoms are not as severe. Generally speaking, a person with dysthymia is able to function in the world. Now, not function as well as they're capable of, but they're able to get out of bed and to take a shower and to go to work and to meet the demands of day-to-day life. And they're not always feeling down. There are moments, there are briefer periods of time when a dysthymic person may feel kind of somewhere in that range of normal that we talked about the other day. But the basic default is mild to moderate depression. So remember back to biopsychosocial. Dysthymia may have some roots in biology. It not as clearly as major depression, in which there's strong roots in brain dysfunction and in genetics. But on the other hand, there does seem to be some amount of genetic loading for dysthymia. But I don't think that that's the greatest part of the etiology of this disorder. I think it has a lot to do with childhood experiences, and especially growing up in certain sorts of ways. Some of you may recognize the name Martin Seligman, Seligman. Back in the 70s, Martin Seligman did a lot of interesting research on a concept that he called learned helplessness. And a lot of that early research was actually done not with human subjects, but with laboratory rats and other animals. But the model can be extended to thinking about the human experience. In learned helplessness, an animal has learned to believe, though it's a false belief, that no matter how hard they try to have control over their environment, they are helpless. And if you believe that you're helpless, That belief will shape not only the way you think, but the way you live your life, the way you act in the world. Uh, if you believe if you're taking this course with me and you believed that no matter how hard you try to succeed in this class, you're doomed to fail, that would shape your behavior in the class. If you know you're going to fail anyway, then why invest a lot of blood, sweat, and tears and energy to give it a go and try to, succeed in the class? Because you already believe that that is not a possibility. There's a certain way in which animals and humans can be raised in childhoods where they have very, very little sense of control over their environment. Now, there's different ways that that can happen. Parents who are control freaks, I mean real control freaks. Most of us think our parents were or are control freaks, but literally don't give a child very much experience of control. It could also happen in a family situation where the parents, for whatever reasons, are not able to consistently parent. And in early childhood, a child experiences a great deal of chaos and unpredictability. And they never quite learn that if I do A, then B happens. If I do C, then D happens. This kind of learned helplessness seems to be one of the ideological vulnerabilities that can load the gun for the development of dysthymia. For you and I to not be depressed, we have to do our best on a daily basis to go out there in the world and make things happen, to add things to our lives that add value and meaning in difficult situations in life, to try to deal with those difficult situations in ways that minimize our own suffering. But you see, if you have learned helplessness, if that's your default belief, then when things go bad or things get difficult in life, you basically abandon all attempts to improve your situation. And of course, that then leads to that great social psych term, the self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because you're deeply believing that you're helpless, you're going to experience a great deal of pessimism about your situation, and you are less likely to go out there into the real world and do what you can do to improve your situation. Now, learned helplessness is not just tied to depression. It can be tied to anxiety. It can be tied to dysfunctional relationships. If you're in a relationship with somebody and you believe that you're helpless in that relationship, that's going to, of course, have real life impact. But we're looking right now about how that sort of childhood sense of helplessness can perhaps load the gun for the development of a dysthymic way of living in the world, and thus chronic depression. Now, as Seligman continued his research after learned helplessness, he began to expand the model, and he began to talk about learned pessimism versus learned optimism. And Seligman's premise, and this is echoed by a lot of cognitive therapists, is extreme optimists and extreme pessimists both distort reality, but they distort it in two very, very different ways. Very optimistic people may not actually be fully in touch with what's really going on in life, but certainly incredibly pessimistic people are not fully in touch either. So learned helplessness and learned pessimism, right? Not born that way, learned to be that way, seem to, in a sense, make a person more vulnerable to developing the symptoms of dysthymia. Let me give you an example of learned pessimism. All of this comes out of a field of psychology called attribution theory. We're the animal because we have such big brains. We're always trying to make sense out of things. We're always trying to attribute or explain why good things happen to us or bad things happen to us, and so on. The way we explain things, whether it's more optimistic or pessimistic, is going to shape the way we act. So if I'm very, very pessimistic in my default personality, if something good happens to me, I'll feel it. I'll say, oh, that was nice. But my next thought will be something like, But you know, that's just one drop of water in the bucket of misery, right? So yeah, so something good happened to me, but 99% of the rest that happens to me is crap. Right? If something doesn't work out in my life the way I want, and I'm a pessimist, I will blame myself. I'll use that as an opportunity to engage in a certain sort of thinking that's around self-loathing, low self-esteem. It's my fault, right? Who knows why? Sometimes when things don't work out for us, it is our responsibility. Other times, bad luck, wrong place, wrong time. And frequently it's a mix of the two. But you see, what counts here in learned optimism and pessimism and learned helplessness is not what the truth is, it's what we think the truth is. And so now if you're an optimist, if you've learned optimism, you'll spin it differently. If you have a lot of optimism and something doesn't work out, instead of blaming yourself and going into that self, I hate me mode, you'll often project the blame out onto other people or other situations, right? If you're a learned optimist and something lousy happens to you, you'll still think to yourself, that sucks. But then you'll say, but that's just one bad thing in the bucket of a lot of good things that are happening to me. Both are distorting reality, but in different sorts of ways. Now, learned optimism sounds great, and it has a lot of advantages, but it is not always such a great thing. If I'm always projecting the responsibility for things onto other people, I'm kind of dead in the water until I accept some responsibility. And also, if I'm sick with a serious life-threatening illness, being really optimistic might actually, some research suggests, interfere with getting early diagnosis and early treatment. I'm just going to think my way to physical health. I'm going to make this cancer go away by thinking about it. Good luck with that. Um, but dysthymia has its roots, not a little bit in biology, but I think it has a lot of roots in terms of childhood experiences and the way we learn to think about ourselves in the world. Now, if that's true, then one of the better treatments for dysthymia would be cognitive behavioral therapy, right? Learning later in life new ways of thinking, new ways of trying out behaviors. Um, and when you talk to somebody who's dysthymic and you're a therapist and you say, and you try to gently make some suggestions, a lot of times dysthymic people will blow those suggestions off, but that's because their dysthymia is interfering with their ability to really think about how different options might have better outcomes for them. So it's a treatable disorder. It's not a medication, antidepressants can help, but I really think the fix for dysthymia is psychotherapy, which really helps somebody look at this inner dialogue that's always running through their heads and how that inner dialogue shapes the experience of despair and shapes the way they do or don't go out there into the world. Okay, there's more about it in the book, so let me refer you to that. All right, so now let's talk about a different type of depression. And this second type of depression is called major depression. And the word major tells you that the severity of symptoms in this type of depression is significant. This is a deeper, darker place with lots of, to go back to our last lecture, cognitive symptoms and somatic symptoms and behavioral symptoms and so on. The level of severity is moderate to severe, occasionally profound. So when somebody's experiencing a major depression, it may not be possible for them to continue to function in the way that they do. They may not be able to go to work. They may not bathe, not feel the energy to cook, take care of themselves. Major depression is it can be a pretty serious depression. And of course, one of the concerns with any sort of larger depression is suicidal ideation, which thoughts and suicidal plans and suicidal actions. And I think I'm going to address that whole issue of suicide in a separate lecture later this week. But I just want you to know that, for anybody who's a therapist working with significantly depressed people, that is always a concern. Now, major depression is one of those disorders where, if treated early and aggressively, in the good way aggressively, can make a tremendous difference as compared to it not being treated until down the road. Major depression, the bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia are three disorders that, without treatment, tend to reoccur, and the symptoms tend to become more severe as time goes on. And so tonight we're talking about major depression, but you're going to hear this again. Early on, major depression is usually characterized by what are called depressive episodes. And so if this is normal mood, in major depression, there would be this drop down to a much lower level of functioning. And then even without treatment in an episode, a person's mood kind of restabilizes and they recompensate to where they were or close to where they were. But what happens over time, and those episodes can last for months untreated, sometimes even longer. What tends to happen without treatment is that those episodes reoccur. And as they reoccur, they can sometimes deepen, and they frequently become longer time intervals. So there's less and less time in a normal mood state. And so one of the ways to think about this is, since major depression is not just psychological, it's also neurological and biochemical. There's a theory that was put out a number of years ago. It's called Kindling Theory. And, to kindle a fire, right? If you're trying to start a fire out in the woods and you take a big log and stick a little match under it, that's never going to burn. So you kindle it, right? You first use, what do I know about starting a fire? Well, I used to start fires as a teenager, but that's for another time, another discussion. But seriously, right? You start leaves burning, and then little twigs and bigger twigs and branches, and you work up to it, right? But once that fire is going, once those logs are burning, it doesn't take a lot to keep them burning. And in a similar sort of way, whatever happens biologically and neurologically in the brain when somebody develops a major depression, once they've been through it once, it takes less stress to kindle it a second time. And often it takes even less stress to rekindle it a third time. So there's a tendency in severe, big depressions, when a person is not really being treated properly, for that disorder to reoccur. And the worst case scenario is that for some folks, they've been down so long in that place that they default to a kind of almost like a continuous significant depression. Let me give you some of the rough statistics on that. If somebody's had one major depressive episode and is not being treated thoroughly, they have about a 60% chance of developing a second major depressive episode. If somebody's had two untreated, they have about a 90% chance of developing a third. And if somebody's had three, they have well over a 90% chance of developing future depressive episodes. So again, you see the case that's being made for early, thorough intervention. Now, a lot of folks with major depression initially are not going to initially go to a therapist's office. They're going to wind up at a family doc's office. And, it varies from doc to doc, but a lot of family docs are really good at recognizing major depression. And I think some of you who have gone to docs lately probably noticed that a lot of family docs are now using a self-inventory. Maybe it's Beck's depression inventory. They're using a scale that they have you fill out every time you go. Of course, the problem is, are there folks who know they're depressed but are going to answer that inventory in a way to minimize the symptoms of depression. So, but some family docs are really good at recognizing, knowing how to read between those lines and getting at it. So the symptoms can be severe, and what brings a lot of people who are depressed to a family doc's office initially are not the psychological symptoms, but the physical symptoms. Depression is not just a psychological or cultural event. It is also, especially big depression, a biological event, a neurological event. The heart beats differently when somebody's depressed. You digest food differently when you're depressed. Your brain chemistry and the way your brain is talking to itself electrically and chemically are different when somebody's depressed. There's an interesting link between people who experience chronic headaches and sometimes unrecognized depression. So sometimes major depression is nicknamed the great imposter because it can look like a lot of other things. And so if I, as a therapist, was evaluating somebody with a new onset major depression, I would absolutely want them to get a physical workup to make sure that there wasn't something going on physically. There can be hormonal problems, thyroid problems. There's all kinds of physiological possibilities that could create the symptoms of big depressions. There are medications that people are prescribed that can do that as well. Some of the older beta blockers to treat heart disease and high blood pressure had a very famous side effect of producing symptoms of depression. So it's a medical cycle, it's a physiological, psychological sort of interplay there. And because of that, if you think about the treatments with dysthymia, antidepressants can help, but really cognitive behavioral therapy or certain types of therapies can really help somebody relearn how to think about themselves in the world. With major depression, psychotherapy absolutely is important, but frequently so are meds, and specifically antidepressant medication. We are now just moving into like the fourth generation of antidepressants. The first antidepressants go back to the 1950s. They were called Mao Inhibitors. They're hardly ever used anymore. They're only really used today when some of the more modern antidepressants don't work for a given individual. One of the reasons with the Mao inhibitors was they can have some pretty scary side effects, and you have to have some dietary restrictions. There's certain kinds of foods you cannot eat if you're taking MAOs. And just to mention to you, St. John's wort, that over-the-counter herbal remedy for mild depression, actually is in part an MAO inhibitor. In the 1960s into the 70s, into the early to mid 80s, they were replaced by what are called tricyclic antidepressants. Those are still sometimes used now. And they're often used for other issues that don't relate to depression. They're used sometimes to help prevent migraine headaches and so on. And they were fairly toxic. And one of the concerns with an antidepressant is obvious. If somebody's very depressed and suicidal, and you're prescribing the meds that have a potential to overdose on, right? One of the advantages of the third generation of antidepressants, the SSRIs and the SSNRIs, are the fact that they are far less lethal than the tricyclics were. The SSRIs, the first one was the one you've all heard of, Prozac, I think 1987, 1988. There are many other ones today. The second S stands for serotonin. Traditional SSRIs they do a lot of things in the brain other than alter serotonin. Let me just make that real clear. It's not just that your brain doesn't produce enough serotonin, and that's why you're depressed. That's one small piece of a much larger package of physical things in your brain, but they work on serotonin. The SSNRIs, like Effexor, they work on both two neurotransmitters. They work on altering serotonin, but they also, it's my brother calling, my brother, the doctor. Pete, I'm taping right now. I'll call you right back. Okay, Peter. That was my brother, the doctor. Yes. His plate is full. Wow. They work on both serotonin and norepinephrine. And actually, what's interesting about the SSNRIs, like venlafaxine, or I'm sorry, Effexor, is that in lower doses, they work on serotonin. In higher doses, they also work on norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is an activating neurotransmitter. It increases one's energy. But what these meds are doing is they're reorganizing the way your brain talks to itself electrically and chemically. Years ago, there was a very simple model of the physiology of depression. It was believed that for genetic reasons or in a response to stress, some people had brains that would simply not make enough serotonin, and that's why you get depressed. And while that's a piece of the puzzle, these meds also work in very, very different ways, above and beyond raising serotonin. They really reorganize the electrical activity in the brain in a bunch of different ways. So now here's the thing, right? Meds can help, but medication by itself doesn't necessarily help you address with the you who's trying to figure out why you got depressed and to trying to comprehend it. So not surprisingly, with major depression, a blend of meds plus the right type of psychotherapy, that combination approach can sometimes be more successful. And also, what psychotherapy can do that meds don't do is psychotherapy can help you learn how to do things a little bit differently in your life to minimize the reoccurrence in the future of the next depressive episode. Now, these meds can be very helpful, but they don't work for everybody. The research varies on this, but somewhere between 60 to 75% of people with severe depressions do have at least a partial or a better than partial response to antidepressants. But there are folks who are called treatment resistant. And these are people who have been tried on many different antidepressants without real response. And there are some experimental treatments out there now, although one's just coming on market. Ultra low dose ketamine can actually, in some of those treatment resistant folks, make dramatic changes in their default mood state. Ultra low dose ketamine doesn't really rebalance the brain chemicals. It actually grows new dendrites, new connections between the neurons in the brain. It allows the neurons, of which we have billions, to begin to physiologically communicate in different sorts of ways. That's ultra low dose ketamine. And ketamine, as you know, I mean, it's been around for years as a recreational drug. It's nicknamed Special K. But the doses that are being used in the research for treatment-resistant depression are so ultra low that a person doesn't have any real conscious cognitive or psychological effect from the ketamine. It's working at a subliminal neurological level in the brain. Okay, I'm just reflecting on what we've been talking about. We're coming up almost on 40 minutes. We've talked about what depression is, normal depression, dysthymic disorder, and major depression. I'm trying to keep these shorter and just sending them out to you more frequently. So I'm going to end this one here. Look for another one coming later in the week. I'm going to talk a little bit about suicide and the issues of suicide as they relate to mood disorders. And then I might tie it together. Then one piece after that will be the bipolar disorder. Also, you'll be getting an email from me later in the week giving you, never ends, does it? Your fourth case study. I was just looking at my email, Arlinden at sussex.edu, and I can see a lot of you have sent your third case studies to me today or yesterday. So I'll be working on those. I hope you're all well. Please be safe and take care. Talk to you soon.